Yes, we can open up to questions, or we can break into small groups and have conversations, which I also think would be a great way to go. Yeah, hi, Christine.
Well, you know, all the issues that you presented as things that you were uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
I think you're correct. Nothing's perfect. And so, how do you arrive at a way to address some of the problems? For example, just one example, you talked about methane, and methane is a problem. Methane production is a problem. But in a sense, some of the larger companies or larger animal producers are able to address that. In California, one of our specialists in the animal science has worked with large dairy people where they take the waste. They have developed a methane, is it a digester? I don't know. They collect their own energy, and they use that energy, they use that methane that is produced to run their own operations, and in fact they're even able to sell some back to PG&E or whatever is appropriate. So I guess what I want to state is you've correctly identified some of the problems, but there are many ways to solutions, and there's not one thing that's necessarily bad, because that bad also brings good. And while you're valuing small and local, and we all like that and want to support our local farmers, some of the big companies have the resources to address safety, environmental sustainability, approaches, and so forth. They can have a huge impact, and they're able to do that because they have the revenue big. So my comment is that things have good and bad sides, and I believe we are most effective when we work to facilitate the good and recognize the bad and work to overcome it.
Your point about economies of scale is absolutely true. I've even heard this argument in relation to the proposed Davis Muni, that we might create a municipal utility in Davis. I've heard the argument that with changes in the renewable portfolio standard, that if you're PG&E, it's a lot easier to transition to solar and wind and increase your purchasing of renewable power if you have those economies of scale than if you're a small, locally owned municipal utility. Yeah, it's true that large corporate actors do have the resources and scale to do a lot of great things. But if you want to create pressure on them to do those types of things, you need engagement, you need policies, and a lot of times, the type of things that the local and alternative food movement represents puts that kind of pressure on big corporate actors who might not necessarily go in that direction unless otherwise prompted. I would say, I kind of think of a lot of these things, and it was true for me. They say recycling is a gateway drug. You start recycling, and then you start getting more involved in environmental action. Marijuana is a gateway drug to higher harder stuff. And I think that when you get involved in these local things, you start growing your garden and you start shopping at the co-op, you start thinking more about our food system and how you might want to see it changed. You might want the waste that's being generated from, industrialized agricultural production to create renewable energy and power. That thing is a resource and shouldn't just sit in a lagoon next to poor people. So, yeah.
So, you asked what about our own faith journey. So kind of in response to both of those, one of the things that Paul and I have really migrated toward is eating less beef, because we are concerned about the impact of methane and what it does to the water source, but also meat in general. So that's a personal decision. That being said, I'm not telling everybody to stop eating meat. I like it a little bit occasionally, and I certainly applaud large companies that are trying to retrieve that methane and use it in a more effective way, because I get very frustrated with the American approach that there's one solution. If we just find that, we'd be okay. And of course, there's never one solution. We need 100 solutions, and we need all of them. And that's one, and cutting back on our meat consumption and meat demand is one, and there are others. There are lots of ways, and we need to try as many of them as we can.
Totally, and that's why I wanted to put a plug in for Robert Reich's new film, Inequality for All. That's the end of the film. That there's all these different ways to get engaged. It's really a call for pluralism, and it's not that there's just one solution to the problem. But a lot of it is just consciousness and engagement. Yeah, Mr. Dan?
You mentioned reverence.
Yeah.
And for me, this is something I've kind of had an awakening about. I kind of just shopped for food and just ate it, almost mechanically. I'm hungry, I eat food, and that's just what you do. And the meat comes from Safeway, of course. Of course, I spent some time in Germany. My wife, who grew up in a relatively rural community, I remember going to a butcher's shop and seeing half of a pig cut this way, hanging from a meat hook, and kind of realizing, wow. It was a little bit shocking to see, and it didn't make me stop eating meat. It just made me more aware of where my meat comes from. But for me, as a person of faith, I think the issue of reverence, awareness that our food comes from somewhere, something has to die for us to eat. And I actually think that's where table grace comes from, sort of in the history of religious piety. We are aware that something's life is given for me to eat, and we give thanks for that. And for us as a faith community, I think that's an important element.
Yeah. Yeah.
You were saying earlier that there are concerns about concentrated feed operations, but there's also a hunger problem. So are there any proposals out there where the animals would be fed maybe on range, which studies have been done that it's more efficient, but we still have this hunger problem? So how do they propose to reconcile those two? Because we already have a hunger problem with crowded conditions, so if we get a more efficient system as it is now, how do they propose to feed all those people?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that argument. It's like, don't we just want cheaper food? Isn't that the solution to hunger? Shouldn't we just increase agricultural yields? Shouldn't we do whatever's most efficient? Doesn't that just drive down the cost of food? Doesn't that improve the conditions of hunger? And I think there's some really thoughtful arguments against that argument. One brilliant one, if you feel like reading it, is Raj Patel's Stuffed and Starved, where he makes the links to obesity and malnutrition across our global food system. I mean, I'm an advocate for the labor movement. My job with the Blue-Green Alliance is about, increasing worker power and having greater wealth. I think that concentration of wealth, of half the world's wealth being held by 85 people, is a lot of where this comes from. I don't know that just driving down the cost of production is the solution for hunger and poverty. I think that we need just redistribution of wealth. I don't think Jesus was opposed to redistribution of wealth, but even Warren Buffett isn't, as a true capitalist.
Yes, Dina.
Yeah.
Halfway down 5, there's an operation of cattle area. And I can't think of exactly where it is. Something like that. Anyway, my question is, if you're familiar with it, would that be an example of a well-run or abuse-run slaughterhouse, so to speak?
I'm actually not familiar with it, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I guess they have their own slaughter. It's a feeding operation.
Okay, feeding.
And it's been very successful.
All right.
Great.
Well, I just want to say, I understand, I imagine it's successful. I mean, one thing that just an element, an illustration of, I bet it is efficient to cram the animals in the small area down there. I'm nervous about this. I imagine that it's efficient to cram all the animals down there, but I've been down to Visalia when there was heat inversion, layers, and the smell in the community all around in that part of the valley, it can be overwhelming. And there are water issues that I think are unaddressed. I think that it's a good example of where you have externalities to this sort of thing that fall most hardest on the people that are least able to take a stand on their behalf. I think the solution is difficult, but anyway, I just wanted to add that about that particular all the feedlots that they have down in that part of the valley.
Yeah, Southern California, we used to always drive past Harris Ranch, and we'd stop at Harris Ranch, and we'd have a beef sandwich, and it was like, Harris Ranch beef, that's quality beef, and now I look at it and I think, God, that's really sad, and for those of us who watched King Corn, a lot of these cows are being fed stuff that they weren't even made to digest, and I don't feel comfortable with it. But you know, it's where's your own, what do you hear in your heart, you know?
We already have an example. You talked about the goal being to drive down the price of the production of food. We already have an example of how poorly that works, and that is that where's the cheapest food in the neighborhood? It's at fast food restaurants, and that's where a lot of the lower income people eat, and that's not a very healthy choice.
Yeah, I would argue for more equity in our economic system is a better way to try and tackle that problem.
And education.
Speaking of restaurants, I've heard programs in other areas, but do you know if Davis has anything addressing restaurant waste and food production waste?
Doug Walter can answer that question.
The city has worked with Davis Waste Removal to start a food waste composting program that, and actually, gosh, I'm trying to remember the name of the restaurant that pushed for it, but the co-op and several restaurateurs were very big in pushing for it. At this time, it is only commercial waste that's being composted. So, you know, if you have something left on your plate, you're still better off taking it home and disposing of it that way. But yes, and the waste is then trucked down to, we're very close to, in Solano County, a commercial scale composting operation.
So that's the city.
Yeah, yeah. So, but it is now, I think, any commercial operation in the city can participate in it. It started as a pilot. I think it's expanded a little bit from that. I don't think there's any thought yet to expand it to residential, because it's a whole different scale.
There's actually like 15 minutes. So why don't we do, you know, this, I love small group discussions when I do teach. You know, I think that not everyone wants to raise their hand in a large room. And the fact that we have a little time, because I flew through my slides because I'm a fast talker, means that why don't we break into little groups of 3 and share some of your own thoughts about your own food and faith journey? I think that would be awesome. What?
And we're gonna have to bring it to a conclusion at 25 after, so that we can, so that people have a chance to refocus and attend the service. So.
Great, 10 minutes. Yeah.
We had a bunch of things to do and references. Do you have any kind of way we can look those up? Or?
I'm happy to post my slides or come talk to me. Yeah, sure.
The broccoli thing, that sounded interesting.
Yeah. That's yeah. Okay, let's talk to each other.
Are you going to keep that?